Nirasya sarva sandeham akikritya sudarshanam prakashita rahasyam tam bhajami gurumishwaram. Shri Govinda Pararavinda Marupananya Vilashodjitan Purna Prema Rasotsavo Jalamano Vritti Prasannananan Shajvad Krishna Kotha Mahamrita Payo Rasho Mudakelato Bande Bhagavatani Mananulavam Murdna Nipatyakshito Namo Mahavaranyaya Krishna Prema Pradayate Krishnaya Krishna Chaitanya Namne Gaura Tvishe Namah Jayatam Surato Pangur Mama Mandamate Gati Matsarvasva Parambojo Radha Madana Mohano Kuladi Devatamor Madana Mohan Jar Sevak Raghunatha Rup Sanatan Jaya Rupa Sanatana Bhatta Raghunath Shri Jiva Gopala Bhatta Dasa Raghunath Echai Goshai Kori Charana Vandan Jaha Haite Vignanasha Bhishta Puran Krishna Dasa Kaviraja Rasika Bhakta Maj Jai Rachilo Caitanya-caritamrta Gaura Govinda Lila Shunite Galai Shila Tahate Na Hoilo Morachita Jeva Nahi Bhuji Keva Shunite Shunite Seha Kiad Bhuta Caitanya-carit Krishna Upajive Priti Janibera Serariti Shunile Borohoit Shriyatam Shriyatam Nityam Giyatam Giyatam Mura Chintyatam Chintyatam Bhakta Caitanya-caritamrta. So by the grace of Sri Kali Yuga Pavana, the Svabhajana Vibhajana, Prayojana Avatar, Prema Purushottam, Karuna Maha Sagar, Sri Gauranga Maha Prabhu, and his beloved Parshad, the most exalted songbird in the inexhaustible sky of Gauralila, Srila Krishnadas, Kaviraj, Goswami Pad. Again, today we'll resume our discussion of Sri Caitanya-caritamrta, and in particular, the Sanatana Shiksha, the discussion of Abhideya Tattva, and more specifically, at present we're in a prakaran about Sadhu Sangha, Mahatmya. So 3 payars have been stated here in the text to stress the importance of Sadhu Sangha. In our last class we read the first one, as well as the verse from the Bhagavatam cited in support of it. So today we'll hear probably the next 2 payars and a couple of very well-known verses from the Bhagavatam which illustrate these points. And we'll look at the commentaries of Sridhara Swami, Sanatana Gosvami, Jiva Gosvami, and others as relevant to the intent for which the citations are made here in the Caitanya-caritamrta. So I've shared the file in the box. It should be available. So unless there's anything else, I'll begin. So I'm starting from Payar 51. This is Madhya Lila, chapter 22. So this is a very famous Bengali statement. Mahad kripa vina kono karme bhakti noy, Krishna bhakti dure rahu sangsara nahi koi. Without the grace of a Mahat, bhakti does not come about by any karma. And let alone attaining Krishna bhakti, samsara does not cease. So the tippani simply says that by any, quote, kono karme, or any karma, means any act at all. In other words, there's nothing you can do to achieve bhakti without receiving the grace of a Mahat. In other words, bhakti comes from bhaktas, doesn't come from anywhere else. So without receiving bhakti from a bhakta, you won't get bhakti by doing any type of karma, any type of action at all. So, now we have two statements in the Bhagavatam which stress this point. So I've just got a comment here, a verse from Srimad Bhagavatam that describes the negation of numerous forms of karma being means to attain Sri Bhagavan is cited. Since bhakti has already been established earlier in this chapter as the sole means to attain Sri Bhagavan and transcend samsara, the description in the verse cited next of various forms of karma being unable to give rise to attainment of Sri Bhagavan indicates that they are not acts of bhakti, and thus evidences the statement made in the present payar. So, there could be an apparent confusion as to how the cited verse illustrates the payar, when the payar is saying that by karma you cannot attain bhakti, whereas in the verse that is cited, it's explaining that by karma you cannot attain Bhagavan. So you might say, okay, I can't attain Bhagavan by karma, but why does that prove that I can't attain bhakti by karma? This doubt could arise, so therefore I've just explained that in this context, this citation is appropriate because it's already been shown in the chapter that Bhagavan is only attained by bhakti. So the implication of Bhagavan not being attainable by karma is that bhakti is not attainable by karma, because it would only be by means of bhakti that one would attain Bhagavan anyway. So this will become more clear as we look at the verse in the commentaries. So, Rahuganai tat tapasanayati nacheyaya nirvapanad grihadva nachandasa naiva jalagni suryair vinamahat padarajo bhishekam. So this is a statement of Jad Bharat to Maharaj Rahugana. I believe everyone is well acquainted with this narration in the Bhagavad, where Bharat Maharaj has been taken by this king Rahugana, who's on his way to meet Kapil Dev in Gangasagar, and required another porter to carry his palanquin. So they saw Jad Bharat off in a field somewhere as they were traveling, and so they ordered him with the authority of the king to carry the king's palanquin. But in time, I won't tell the whole story, but the king eventually understands that Jad Bharat is not just some large-bodied, strong fellow wandering out in a rural area with nothing better to do. Rather, he is a great sage, and thus he hears many teachings from Jad Bharat, and this is one of them. So Rahugana is the king whom Jad Bharat is addressing. So he says, O Rahugana, neither by austerity, nor by sacrifice, nor by giving, nor by household life, nor by the Vedas, nor by worship of water, fire, and the sun, does one attain this without bathing in the foot dust of a mahat. So the term mahat is found throughout the Bhagavad, as well as the term mahanta and mahatma. So generally speaking, these are all synonymous. And a little bit later in this chapter, there's a verse where the term mahanta arises, and which is discussed by Jiva Gosvami in Bhakti Sandarbha as giving effectively a definition of a mahat or a mahanta by listing some of their characteristics. So those who've studied the Bhakti Sandarbha are familiar with that verse, and it will come later in this chapter. So we'll look at how the Bhagavatam defines a mahat or a mahatma a little bit later. So therefore it's not cited here. Rather, the stress here is on the fact that karma is not a means to bhakti without the grace of such a mahat. So the following citation will give a little bit more give some indication about the characteristics of a mahat, and later in the chapter they'll become more elaborately discussed. So that's why we're not diving into that at this moment. So, first of all, to put this in context, what this Jad Bharat statement literally says is that one does not attain, quote, this, or etat. So, the pronoun obviously refers to whatever was mentioned in the previous verse. So, that's contextualized and demonstrated in the commentaries. And there are two different lines of interpretation of how all these different varieties of karma are described. Sanatana Gosvami gives one type of interpretation, Jiva Gosvami gives another, so we'll look at both. So first of all, Sri Jivapad explains in his commentary on this verse that the mention of, quote, this in the verse refers ultimately to Sri Bhagavan. Quote, now he describes association with the Sats alone being the cause in regard even to intentness or samukya upon the supreme entity, Paratattva, and states this by means of a negative assertion. So you can either say, X is the only means to Y, or you can say, without X, you'll never get Y. So in this case, it's affirmed by means of a negative assertion. So he speaks this verse. So one does not attain, quote, this entity, who is known as Bhagavan, by the Vedas, that is by brahmacharya, by household life, meaning grihastha dharma, by austerity, that is by vanaprastha, by letting go, that is by sannyas, by sacrifice, that is by worship of the various devatas therein, those related to the aforementioned ashramas, and even by the particular activity in that regard of worship of water, fire, and the sun, without bathing in the foot dust of mahats, because of only that, meaning such bathings, being the cause of fitness for the awareness of that, entity, namely Bhagavan, by virtue of that bathings being purifying of everything else, that is, all forms of disqualification from that attainment. So, Jiva Goswami is reading this verse as an allusion to Varnashram Dharma. In other words, that all of the ashramas are thought to be indicated by the mention of the Vedas, austerity, renunciation. He considers this to refer to the duties of a brahmachari, the duties of a grihastha, the duties of a vanaprastha, the duties of a sannyasi, and he takes the other elements listed in the verse as varieties of worship or ritual that are followed by those members of those various ashramas. So neither by observing any of those ashrama dharmas can one attain the supreme entity. And why not? Then he says that because it's only by bathing, quote, bathing in the foot dust of a mahat. So does that mean if you literally find a mahat and then put his foot dust on your head that this will automatically happen? Unlikely. Rather, this is, to be considered an allusion to associating with a mahat in an attitude of great deference and respect, such that one's psyche can be colored by or can receive a sanskar for bhakti by the effect of that mahat's association. So to, quote, bathe in someone's foot dust is considered to be a gesture which demonstrates the highest degree of reverence that someone can show. But it's not that literally, in all cases, the performance of the physical gesture will produce the effect. Rather, the physical gesture is mentioned to represent the attitude of great respect, faith, and interest in showing honor, offering of service, etc. So when one associates with the mahat, just to put it plainly, on one's best behavior, then one is, blessed by that person and their association, example, teaching, etc., such that one acquires affinity for what is held dear in the heart of that Mahatma. So that's essentially what's referred to here. And so Jiva Gosvami speaks of this, quote, bathing in the foot dust, perhaps leveraging the metaphor a little bit by describing it as being purifying of everything else. In other words, all the unfavorable forms of vasanas that are contrary to bhakti are purged by associating with one who's one-pointed upon bhakti, such that one's own bhakti vasana becomes the predominant vasana within the psyche. So that bathing in the foot dust of the sadhu, or that fully attentive adoration of the sadhu, purifies oneself of all the unfavorable attitudes that may be present in one's mind. So this is how he interprets it. And Sanatana Gosvami, following Sridhara Swami's way of interpreting it, gives another reading, which is, largely in the same vein, but he gives slightly different content for some of the elements mentioned. So let's look at this as well. And Sanatana Gosvami, just as a footnote, he actually gives a few different commentaries on this. He comments on it in Hari Bhakti Vilas, he comments on it in Brihad Bhagavatamrita, and I believe in one other place. But what was specifically relevant here, I felt, was the commentary he gives in the Brihad Bhagavatamrita, because it offers an alternate view from the view that Jiva Gosvami gives, and it reflects Sridhara Swami's view, so there's no need in also studying Sridhara Swami's commentary, since you get the gist of Sridhara Swami's commentary just through this one. So he says the following. In the previous verse, Gyanam Vishuddham, Vasudev, who is known as Bhagavan, is understood to be Brahman. A person does not attain this supreme Brahman in the form of the blessed son of, Vasudev, there's a typo, who is known as Bhagavan, by means of austerity and so on. So now he gives his interpretations of the elements in the list. Austerity, tapas, refers to observance of one's dharma, or to one-pointedness of mind. Even by that, or by sacrifice, that is by Vedic rites, by giving, that is by distributing food and the like, by household life, that is by moderately helping others for that purpose, for the purpose of sustaining their household lives, by the Vedas, that is by study of the Vedas, or even by worship of water and so on, one cannot attain the supreme Brahman. In that regard, by the word water, Varuna, the overseer thereof, is to be understood. In other words, the principal devata of the element is what is referred to by the word for the element. By this, other devas as well are to be regarded as being referred to. That is, the mention of water, fire, and the sun refers to the worship of the devatas of these elements, Varuna, Agni, and Surya. Alternately, the meaning is even by entering water or fire, or even by piercing into the sun, one cannot attain the supreme Brahman. So there are various yogic paths we hear about by which different types of austerity are performed by absorbing oneself in water or fire, or by entering the sun by some yogic means. So none of these things will suffice either. Without what? Then the main point is this. Without bathing in the foot dust of the Mahats, one cannot attain the supreme Brahman by any of the aforementioned practices, because of that bathing's being the supreme tirtha. So just as conventionally one bathes in a tirtha, then the importance of learning bhakti from someone who has bhakti is represented in this idea of bathing in the dust of their feet, which of course is a charming ornament of contradiction, since normally covering oneself with dust is considered to be the opposite of purification, but in this case it's considered or meant to allude to the highest form of purification. So the intent, tatparya, here is this. He, the supreme Brahman, is attainable even by means of austerity and so on, when one has the grace of the Mahats, and is also attainable just by that is, just by the grace of the Mahats alone, without those other means, namely austerity and so on. So he, that is the supreme Brahman, is never attainable without that is, without the grace of the Mahats. Alternately, he is attainable just by means of that, meaning the grace of the Mahats alone, and not rather by means of those other means, because of their inability in regard to accomplishment of that attainment of him. So if you get the grace of the Mahat, you will attain bhakti, you will attain Bhagavan. Whether you did austerity or not, whether you performed such study of the Veda or observance of sacrifice or not. So what is essential is to receive the grace of a Mahat, and if you have the grace of the Mahat, you may also perform those activities should you be in some social circumstances where it's merited to do so, which we can say in the modern day is quite rare, so effectively nil. Rather, to get the grace of a Mahat is the prime and sole necessity. So this is the point being stressed in the verse. And then we have a little bit more discussion here. The primary means by which the association of Mahats so greatly benefits a jiva is described in the statement of Jad Bharat in Srimad Bhagavatam, following the verse under discussion. So, if we look at the following verse in the Bhagavatam, it's also important, because sometimes there can be excessively literal interpretation of this statement, and one thinks, okay, I need to go to Braj, I need to go out to Govardhan or some place and find some sadhu, and I need to go, roll around in the dust by his feet, or I need to go rub his feet and then rub the dust all over my head, and then I'll be following what the Bhagavatam says. So, maybe, but rather, it's not quite that simple. And what is it about, quote-unquote, bathing in the dust of their feet? What is actually being referred to, and how is it that actually benefits one? Is it just some, unseen magic that you put this dust on your head and suddenly the whole entire functioning of your psyche just magically transforms? Is it like that? Or might there be more to it? So, the following verse in the Bhagavatam says this, or it describes that in the association of those Mahats, or in that act of honoring the Mahats, what actually happens, or what is going to be going on there. So the verse says the following. And it's actually, if you look at it in the context of the Bhagavatam, it's one sentence that actually spans 2 verses. So it's ideal, to read these excerpted statements in context. And sometimes when they're cited and quoted out of context, some of what they intend to convey can get lost. So therefore, we'll look at the following verse, which says the following. Amongst whom, that is amongst the Mahats, is sung recounting of the qualities of he of highest praise, Sri Bhagavan, on account of which termination of village talk occurs, and which upon being honored, daily produces a seeker of moksha's genuine inclination towards Vasudeva. I'll read this one more time. Amongst whom is sung recounting of the qualities of he of highest praise, on account of which termination of village talk occurs, and which upon being honored daily produces a seeker of moksha's genuine inclination towards Vasudeva. So, when it says recounting of the qualities, this essentially just means kirtan. The word is anuvad, so I've rendered it a little bit literally, but what it simply means is that in the company of the Mahats, what will you find? What happens? Bhagavad Katha. Be it, musical kirtan, or be it discussion, or what have you. When you're in their company, then what will you find? You will find that the subject matter is always Bhagavan and bhakti to him. Mat chitta mad gatha prana bhurayantas parasparam kathayantas chamam nityam tusyanti cha ramanti cha. In the second of the 4 essential verses of the Gita, those who are wise are described as being engaged in worship of Bhagavan, and in what manner? With their mind, with their hearts given over to him, and in the company of one another, always discussing him, enlightening one another about him, and thus rejoicing. So, in the company of such, the word there in the Gita is Buddha, which here we can take equivalent to be a Mahatma or a Mahat, since the Gita also elsewhere describes a Mahatma as such. What's that verse? 9:13. Mahatmanam tumam parta. It doesn't come to my mind. Anyway, you all know that verse where it describes the Mahatmas as with one pointed mind engaging in kirtan and so forth of Bhagavan. So, that being said, a question can also arise for those acquainted with Rupa Goswami's line of thought, where it says that the fruit of this association, or the effect of being in this association of the Mahat, is that a seeker of moksha's inclination towards Vasudeva is acquired. So you might say, well, I'm not a seeker of moksha. Moksha is another desire other than the desire for bhakti. That's anya bilash. So a seeker of moksha's inclination to Bhagavan, that sounds like Jnana-mishra bhakti. That sounds like people who are using bhakti as a means to attain moksha. So is that what this is being referred to? So the commentators deal with this, and therefore we'll look at the commentaries. So Sri Sanatana Pad comments on this verse as follows. Amongst whom, that is amongst mahats, recounting of the qualities, that is discussion of the qualities beginning with Bhakta Vatsalya, affection for bhaktas, of Bhagavan Sri Krishna, he whose glory is Uttama. So the name of Bhagavan in this verse is Uttama Shloka, which is a name used for Bhagavan repeatedly in the Bhagavatam. So Sanatana Gosvami gives a nice double meaning of what this name Uttama Shloka can mean. The word shloka, some may be acquainted with this as a reference to a word for a verse, or an anushtup verse in particular, but the word shloka also conveys the meaning of praise or glory. So he whose glory, so in this context, the word shloka means glory or greatness. So he whose shloka is uttama. So then he gives two meanings of the word uttama. One is taintless, or meaning because of which darkness becomes withdrawn. So if tama is taken to mean tamas, or darkness, then he takes the prefix ud as udgata, or to have gone away, or vanished. So that because of which darkness vanishes, or in other words, which he whose glory sheds light, that is uttama shlok. Or if you take uttama as being above tamas, or above darkness, meaning free from any taint or any blemish or what have you. And also, he doesn't give this meaning, but elsewhere the word uttama can also mean tama in the superlative sense of ut meaning utkrishta, so that which is superlative or most superior or excellent. So he who is of the greatest glory. Such meaning is also possible. But in this context, Sanatana doesn't give that meaning. He gives the two we've found here. So, in that association of the Mahatmas, then the glories of Uttama Shloka is sung. That is, it occurs of its own accord. So because these Mahatmas, Caitanya-caritamrta nityam, because they're always talking about me, then if you're there, bathing in the dust of their feet, in other words, sitting respectfully and listening to them, then this is what you'll hear. This is what you'll find. You'll find that of its own accord, you get the chance to hear them talking about Bhagavan, speaking in praise of Bhagavan. Then he gives an alternate meaning. So the word yatra, this pronoun, in the first interpretation, he's taking it to refer to the mahats, but that's actually perhaps the less likely or the less sort of default interpretation that you would give. Typically it would refer not to an element within a compound in the previous verse, but to the entire compound itself. So so read in that way, it would refer to the whole compound, which is bathing in the foot dust of mahats. So if you take this in which, or this wherein, this word yatra, he says alternately means when bathing in the foot dust of mahats occurs, in other words, when or where that bathing is happening, then recounting of the qualities of highest praise is sung by a person. In other words, when one goes to honor the mahats, then one will also speak in praise of Bhagavan, one will also engage in this, as this is the appropriate way to speak with and the appropriate way to converse with persons of such nature. In either case, that, meaning recounting of the qualities of highest praise, on account of which termination of village talk occurs, furthermore, upon being honored daily, even by one who is extremely attached to objects of the senses, produces the genuine, that is firm inclination towards the blessed son of Vasudeva, of a seeker of moksha, that is, of one who is detached from objects of the senses. So when one hears this talk, then it describes it as bringing about the cessation of village talk. In other words, once you have a taste for this kind of talk, other talk is no longer relishable. So, of one's own accord, one no longer wishes to participate or to listen to it. And by daily hearing this, by, in other words, regularly subjecting oneself to its influence, then to stress the powerful effect that it has, then it says here that one who is extremely attached to objects of the senses. Here it says, parama vishoy asakta. So this is interesting language. Many times, sometimes bhaktas, they may feel, how do I get free from my material attachments? How do I become detached from the world? Or, something like this. So, not that there's any necessity of doing that, apart from simply engaging in Bhagavad Katha. In other words, he's saying, even if one is extremely attached, if one every day continuously hears about Bhagavan and hears about him as he is described by Mahatmas, in other words, as his glories are sung by our Rupa Gosvami Pad, by our Sanatana Gosvami Pad, by our Jiva Gosvami Pad, by our Raghunath Dasa Gosvami Pad, if we can hear Bhagavan as he's praised by them, then, regardless of how attached we may be, inclination towards him will come about and will eventually pierce through, or rather overshadow and overcome, that attachment to objects of the senses. In other words, eventually, the vasana for bhakti, nourished by that kata, will eventually become stronger than one's vishoy vasana, or one's attachment or inclination towards varieties of worldly experience. So, simply trying to restrain one's behavior that arises as the effect of having a strong vishoy vasana will not be as fruitful as simply nourishing and supporting the strength of another vasana which can eventually outgrow and overpower the vishoy vasana. So this is essentially why vairagya is not an anga or not an integral part of the path of bhakti, and rather why bhakti itself and ruchi for bhakti itself can lead to the transcendence of samsara independent of any direct cultivation of vairagya as a separate practice, as was discussed in the Sindhu and as we've discussed previously. So, as I mentioned, the doubt can arise in this verse that when it refers to acquiring a seeker of moksha's inclination to Bhagavan, then you might say, I don't think I want that. I want a bhakta's inclination to Bhagavan. So Sanatana Pad is saying, oh, don't worry. When he's talking about a seeker of moksha, we'll just take that to mean someone who's not seeking things of the mundane. In other words, it's not literally, he's not taking it as having an emphasis on the attainment of moksha specifically. He's taking it as simply being the inclination of one who's free from inclination to the mundane. So, in this way, it doesn't need to be read in contrast to or in contradiction to the idea of a one-pointed aspiration for bhakti. Alternately, recounting of the qualities of highest praise upon being honored in full daily produces genuine, that is, excellent inclination towards the blessed son of Vasudeva, even for a seeker of liberation, by means of causing relinquishment of the desire for liberation and so on. That is, as well as the desire for all objects apart from bhakti to Bhagavan. So he gives an alternate interpretation where the quote, a seeker of moksha, this possessive, isn't referring to the inclination that's achieved, but rather is the person who's doing the achieving. So in that sense, it means that by hearing this, then even persons who previously were interested in seeking moksha, or specifically a notion of a pavarga that didn't involve eternal bhakti to Bhagavan, that they then acquire the bhakti vasana, they then acquire inclination for bhakti over and above even moksha as a purushartha. So this is also another way the statement can be interpreted. So this verse was cited to stress the point that without the grace of a Mahat, then one will not attain Bhagavan, one will not attain Bhakti. But rather by having the association of a Mahat, one will hear Bhagavad Katha, one will receive the grace of a Mahat, and by that one will achieve Bhakti by means of the installation, if you will, in the heart of the Vasana for Bhakti. So that illustrates the point that's made in the first half of the Payar. Mahat Kripa Vina Kono Karme Bhakti Noi, which, at least in the Bengali community of Gaudiya Vaishnavas, is a very, very well-known statement that you'll hear, repeatedly again and again throughout public lecturing and so forth. But the Payar also made an additional statement that not only will you not get bhakti, but you won't get out of samsara either, by any means. So now he cites a second verse to illustrate the second point made in the Payar. And this verse is also a very well-known verse from the Bhagavat spoken by Prahlad to Hiranyakashipu. Naisham matis tavaru kramangrim sprishartyanarta bhagamo yararta mahiyasam parajobhishekam niskinchananam navinita javat. Their inclination, the need of which is the cessation of the insubstantial, does not touch the feet of he of great stride, or urukram, meaning Bhagavan, so long as one shall not accept a bath in the foot dust of the divested, the great ones. So this citation is, you can see, is given as like a parallel to the other one, because both the previous citation and this citation speak of this idea of bathing in the foot dust, and one verse uses the word mahat, this verse uses the word mahiya, which have the same meaning, mahatma, mahanta, one who is great. And here, then we have one qualifier of those who are great. They're described as being niskinchan, which I've given here as divested, for reasons that we'll find in the commentary, and which literally means who, quote, have nothing, or are without anything. So what does that allude to? Let's see how the commentators interpret it. So again, we'll look at this verse within some of the context of how it's spoken in the Bhagavatam. And in the Bhagavatam, this is the third of a set of 3 verses that Prahlad Maharaj speaks in response to comments or sharp remarks made to him by his father. So we'll look at the 2 previous statements that Prahlad makes, because putting them together helps us understand the intent of what comes in the third. So Sri Prahlad speaks this verse preceded by 2 others in response to his father's questioning him as to where he had acquired the understanding that performance of bhakti is the greatest form of learning. So after a year of school, Hiranyakashipu had called Prahlad, and with pleasure had held him on his lap and wanted to hear him say what was the best thing that he'd learned in school thus far. So Prahlad answered with the famous statement, Shravana Kirtana Vishnu Smarana, that this, performing bhakti constituted of these 9 activities of hearing, praising, remembering, and so on. When this is offered to Bhagavan, this is the greatest learning. So Hiranyakashipu becomes furious with this answer, and then demands to know, where did you learn this? The gurus I put, you in tuition with, they certainly didn't teach you this. Where have you learned this? So, in response to that statement, that question of Hiranyakashipu, Prahlad Maharaj makes these statements. Quote, inclination towards Krishna cannot arise on account of another, on its own, or on account of both, that is, on its own and account of another, for those intent upon household life, who have entered darkness because of uncontrolled senses, and whose chewing is only of the chewed therein, again and again. They, of debased mind, who honor only those whose aim is in the external, certainly do not understand Vishnu, he who is the object to be reached, only by only for those whose aim is related to the self. They also become bound by the strong strands of Isha's cord, like the blind being led by the blind. Their inclination, the need of which is the cessation of the insubstantial, does not touch the feet of he of great stride, so long as one shall not accept a bath in the foot dust of the divested, the great ones. So Samipad comments as follows. He characterizes Prahlad's thoughts after Hiranyakashipu's question to him as follows, quote, "Let this discussion be," means stop, "on account of the lack of eligibility for it on the part of those such as you all who are attached to objects of the senses." So Hiranyakashipu says, "What's the greatest thing you've learned so far, my son?" And Prahlad says, "Bhakti." And Hiranyakashipu becomes furious. So, where did you learn this? So Prahlad thinks, okay, better I not talk about this anymore. In other words, this is a Vishayi. He is thinking he's riveted only upon Vishay. So it's inappropriate to speak at length about bhakti, about how bhakti is learned and so forth with those who are averse to it. So therefore he decides, let it be, I won't further explain. So rather, he gives this remark, which is not a direct response to his father's question, but rather an explanation as to why his father won't understand the actual answer to the question. So with this intent, Prahlad says to Hiranyakashipu, Matir, he speaks this verse. Inclination towards Krishna cannot come about on account of another, on its own, or on account of both, that is, on account of both of these mutually. For whom? Those whose intent, that is resolve, is solely upon household life, meaning those whose concern is the duties of household life alone. Thereby they have entered darkness, that is samsara, because of their uncontrolled senses, and therein their chewing is only of the chewed. In other words, they repeatedly absorb themselves only in things that are not ultimately satisfying, because they don't have control over their senses. And they take up the rituals and the rules and the so on and so forth of household life under the pull of those senses to have repeated experiences of things that will never actually satisfy them. And in that state, even if you come and try to tell them that there's something better that they could be doing, they won't listen, they don't want to hear it, and nor will their attitude change just by continuing to experience the dissatisfaction that they always have. So the question is raised. If the objection is raised, well, because of Krishna's being the embodiment of the supreme bliss, won't they too also certainly become endowed with fixity upon him? That is, won't they also foster an inclination and devotion towards Krishna, since everyone fundamentally is seeking bliss, and Krishna is the ultimate source of bliss? In other words, what if you just come and tell them about Krishna? Won't that solve everything? So he says, no, because they're ignorant of him, that is, they of debased mind, whose psyche is affected by objects of the senses, certainly do not understand Vishnu. In other words, it's not so simple as knowledge, it's not so simple as a lack of information. Their psyche is heavily conditioned by their ongoing experience of varieties of sense objects. That conditioning, the pull that it has over them, the inability that they have to control their senses as a result of that conditioning, that doesn't go away even if you just stick some new information in their mind. So he describes their mind as thus debased, or it's dur, it's in an unfavorable or a mal-aligned condition. And therefore, in that circumstance, they don't understand Vishnu. In other words, even if you tell them about Vishnu, they don't understand, they won't grasp, they won't realize the significance or the value of what is being described. The cause in this regard is that he is the object to be reached only for those whose aim, that is Purushartha, is related specifically to the self. In other words, when someone's fixity is only upon sensory experience and not upon an attainment that's had not by the mind and senses, but rather by the Atma, rather by that aspect of the composite self or the mind-body complex that will live on eternally beyond the existence of the mind and body, unless one has that sense of notion of self and aspires to that self's relation with a supreme self, then all this talk won't be of any interest. It won't seem applicable or to be of any ultimate importance. So when the Purushartha is not something related to Bhagavan, who is the capital S self or the Paramatma, and rather is fixed upon things to be had by external means, then these people will not have any interest in even what they're told. So a question is further raised. Well, they too will understand Vishnu by means of instruction from a guru. In other words, well, what if someone comes and teaches them real nice? What if they get a good teacher who explains it all very well? To that he says, those whose disposition is to honor as a guru only those whose aim is in the external, that is in the objects of the senses. So he's saying, these type of people will never accept such a guru. In other words, a guru who will teach them these things, they don't think that that person is a guru. They don't want to even hear from that type of person. For them, a guru is what you have in modern day society, like sales gurus and real estate gurus and, people who teach people how to achieve other, means of art and kama. Those are their gurus. Those whose only objective or whose aim is in external pursuits. They only consider people like that gurus. So thus, as the blind being led by the blind, do not know the path and rather fall into a ditch, so they too verily become bound by the rights related to objects of enjoyment, described in the strong strands, known as the Brahmanas and so on, within Isha's long rope in the form of the Vedas. So a rope is a composite entity made up of a variety of strands. So he's saying that here the word Brahmanas doesn't mean people. The word Brahmanas is a particular portion of the Vedas. So the particular sections of the Vedas that describe the means by which you can perform various types of rituals to achieve different types of objects of enjoyment, these are like the strands in the rope that bind people within their worldly experience. So they only accept as gurus people who teach them those things. They only accept as gurus those who teach that aspect of the Veda. In other words, the aspect of the Veda that helps them perpetuate and remain fixed in external sensory experiences, or loosely speaking, Vishay. So they only accept Vishayis as gurus. So they're like the blind being led by the blind. They're blinded by their own mental conditioning and uncontrolled senses, and in that blind state, they accept another blind person who's also under that influence to lead them by means of these rituals and these activities of the pursuit of various worldly forms of enjoyment. So then they remain stuck in this way. They don't have any Purushartha related to Bhagavan. They don't accept as a guru a Mahatma, or one who would ever teach them about a greater object. So thus they end up in the ditch, so to speak. Thus it is said, for those whose mind is absorbed in the objects of the senses, absorption in Vishnu is very far off. Can one attain an object situated in the west by going to the east? No. In other words, they just remain perpetually stuck in that condition. So now, another important consideration is raised. Well, furthermore, how do they not understand Vishnu, who is explained in the Shrutis, like the Sheteshwar Upanishad, where it says, quote, one Deva is hidden in all beings, all-pervading, and the innermost self of all beings. And why do they enter darkness? So you might say, well, they have gurus. Those gurus also teach them some parts of the Upanishads. They've heard these common, well-known statements that there's this entity called Vishnu, who's the all-pervading, preserving, supreme entity. So Why would after being taught that, would they end up in this condition? So to answer that, this third verse is stated, quote, until one shall accept a bath in the foot dust of the greatest of the Mahats, the divested, the Nishkinchanas, that is, they who have cast away self-conceit based on objects of the senses. In other words, one who doesn't identify with the body and takes no pride in any acquisition within the phenomenal world. Those persons are, without anything, or they are, divested or dispossessed of anything of this plane, because let alone possessing something of it, they don't even identify as being a member of it. So unless one bathes in the foot dust of those type of Mahatmas, until then, their inclination, even if produced by statements of the Shruti, this is interesting. In other words, even if they hear the Shastra, still they don't actually become inclined upon Bhagavan. Rather, their inclination, quote, does not touch, that does not attain the feet of he of great stride, namely Bhagavan. Meaning it is obstructed from doing so by impossibility and so on. Means it goes one ear in one ear and out the other. Even though they hear, it doesn't lodge anything. Even though they hear, no sanskar is formed. Or rather, the sanskar that's formed is not a bhakti sanskar. So, this is the power or the effect of whatever conditioning is predominant in the mind, is that it has a strong sway over what future influences that one has, the extent to which those future influences will get the opportunity to, quote-unquote, make much of an impression or not. So just as a bhakta who's steeped in the activities of bhakti, who has a very strong bhakti vasana, may, perceive sense objects, but the wind blows in, the wind blows out, it's of no great significance, they don't pay much attention, and thus, even though they're in the midst of this world of sense objects, they don't remain bound within it. The opposite is also the case. Even the people who are heavily riveted upon this sensory experience, once in a while they're reminded of Vishnu, once in a while they hear these other things, once in a while they go to the temple at Durga Puja and they say Om Vishnu and do their achman before they do their Durga Puja to pray to Durga Devi for their cloth and money and whatever else they want. Even though they're culturally informed or they may have heard these things, it makes no impression to them, they have no inclination towards it, and they just remain perpetually stuck, if you will, in the mentality that they have. So this is what he's alluding to by saying that unless they bathe in the foot dust of a Mahat, in other words, unless they associate with a Mahatma in a way that they actually open themselves to being significantly influenced and to actually give importance to what is being said and allow that to take hold within their own heart and mind, unless and until that happens, even if they're, peripherally exposed to these other things, it won't really have any effect. So he describes such persons as follows by saying, the need of which, that is the necessity of which inclination, is touching his feet, is the cessation of the insubstantial, that is samsara. So the need of these people is to become free from their attachment to samsara, that their present inclination is completely upon samsara. So the necessity then is that their inclination become turned away from samsara, or it, be adjusted such that their samsara reaches cessation. In the absence of favor from the Mahats, they of debased mind have no certainty about the nature of existence, and so also no attainment of moksha. This is the meaning. In other words, they don't acquire knowledge of the higher reality, and therefore that they achieve realization of that higher reality and liberation from the false reality. These things will never happen. So this comment of Sri Rupa Gosvami, in addition to being illuminating of the context in the Bhagavatam, also shows how exactly the pyre under discussion is demonstrated by this citation. So, quote, in these comments, Sri Sridhar Samipad's gloss of, quote, the cessation of the insubstantial as the cessation of samsara demonstrates how the verse under discussion evidences the statement made in the previous payar that samsara does not cease without the grace of a mahat. So I think that's clear. That was the point that was meant to be taught, and in the verse itself, it just uses this word anartha, and so that Samipad shows that the word anartha means samsara. Then we can see how what's stated in the payar is directly reflecting what is stated here in the Bhagavad, or, that Mahaprabhu, these, the authors of these things are, rendering these summaries of the Bhagavatam. So it can also be seen that the payar is like conveying the gist of this Bhagavatam verse by rendering the word anartha in the Bhagavatam as per Sridhar Swami's commentary with the word samsara. Okay, then I'm almost out of time here. I might go a couple of minutes over, pardon me, but I'm just going to finish this discussion. There's just a paragraph left. Sri Jivapad alternately interprets this phrase to refer to the cessation of obstruction to there, that is the touch of Bhagavan, the feet of Bhagavan's touch, meaning that it is only by the grace of the Mahats that there occurs the removal of the obstructions to the inclination of one's mind being fixed upon the feet of Bhagavan. So, that interpretation might be more in the vein of what we like to see, so to speak, in the theology of Rupa Gosvami. But because the payar is referring to samsara, then the previous interpretation is perhaps more akin to demonstrating what the intent is here in the Caritamrta. So both are valuable. In addition to Sri Samipad's explanation of the Mahats being, quote, divested, as their having cast away self-conceit based on objects of the senses, Sri Sanatana Pad in his commentaries on these verses adds that Mahats being, quote, divested or nishkinchan can also be understood to refer to their being indifferent towards everything by virtue of their regard only for Bhagavad Bhakti, and their having relinquished all acquisition of worldly objects out of love for Bhagavan. So the word niskinchan in a more literal sense of being without anything can mean possessionless, or it can mean having no interest or having no attachment to anything else. And why not? Because one's sole interest or one's sole attachment is to bhakti, to Bhagavan. So he gives these, so it can refer to physical possession, it can refer to object of interest, and it can refer to sense of identity. So in this way, we get three interpretations. And now a fourth, Sri Chakravarti Pad further comments that their being, quote, divested refers to their having relinquished desire for conventional wealth, sons, wife, karma, and gyan, by virtue of conviction in the statement of Bhagavan made earlier in the third canto, quote, they who have given up karmas and given up relatives and friends for me are sadhus, and that one is a mahat by virtue of having a singular inclination for bhakti alone. Sri Jivapad also takes the verse under discussion and the two verses preceding it in Srimad Bhagavatam as evidence for the conclusion stated in the payar being evidenced by this citation, that bhakti cannot be attained without the association of a sadhu. Quote, thus, association with the sats alone being the fundamental cause in this regard is established. That, furthermore, is befitting because of the impossibility of that otherwise coming about for those possessed of obliviousness of him based on a beginninglessly existent non-awareness of him. And this verse, or these three verses, demonstrate that conclusion. So this citation and this whole set of three verses, or three payars stressing the importance of sadhu sangha, and this citation of this statement of Prahlad, we find that Jiva Gosvami cites this very same statement to make this very same point in Bhakti Sandarbha when he's trying to stress the importance of sadhu sangha. So, intertextually then we can see how what's coming and being emphasized here in the Caritamrta is, straight parallel with how Jiva Gosvami has presented things in the Bhakti Sandarbha. So I'll stop there for today. We've got one more payar, the third of the three, that stress the importance of sadhu sangha. So we'll look at that and the verses of the Bhagavatam that illustrate it next time. So if anyone has comments, questions, corrections, or otherwise, please feel free to share.
Pranam, Babaji.
Pranam.
Pranam. So, once this topic to hear the mahant for acquiring the bhakti, from where the sadhaka can find the resource to have the discernment to find this such a mahant, such a bhakta. Where can he find? Where can he have the resource for that? Actually, for that sangha.
When you say resource, what exactly do you mean?
Yes, I mean the intelligence, the understanding, all what is necessary to distinguish who is fit to give the knowledge.
Well, the Shastra, in other words, the Shastra gives what are called the lakshanas, or the characteristics of a mahat. As I mentioned, those will come in a verse that comes up later in this chapter. They're also discussed by Jiva Gosvami in the Bhakti Sandarbha, based on the Bhagavatam. And there are numerous cases in the 3rd canto, in the 11th canto, and elsewhere, where Bhagavan lists the characteristics of his bhaktas, of those who are Mahatmas. So, generally speaking, one can understand who is a sadhu in the light of the definitions and the characteristics of a sadhu that are mentioned in the Shastra. But, even if one hears those things, it helps to learn them from one who is a sadhu. So there becomes a bit of a rub, so to speak, that if one hears those statements in the Shastra, but they're explained by someone whose understanding of them is a bit slanted, then one still might end up, even with the idea that they are following the Shastra, not actually following it, or not actually following the intent of what was originally stated. So, in that respect, it comes back to what we discussed in the previous classes, and why again and again that word is used, yadrich, or yadrichaya in the instrumental, that it's by fortune that one acquires this samskar that's an effect of association with the mahat. In other words, it's ultimately, there's an element that's even beyond one's own intellectual ability that brings one into the association. In other words, one by destiny, so to speak, may come into the association of someone who can help one more than one can help oneself. Or in other words, one's level of understanding might be able to lead someone a certain degree, but if one comes into the company of someone whose understanding is far greater than that, one can be benefited beyond even one's capacity to help oneself. So that's ideal, or therefore it's called grace, or it's called fortune. But that's something that's not, directly attainable, or something that one within one's own ability can directly effect. And that's why, we see so many cases in the Puranas of kings and other persons, rejoicing so profoundly at having been met by such a person who was more wonderful than they could imagine, so to speak. But, while that's certainly desirable, and to, seek or to hope to meet such sadhus is ideal, at the same time, that doesn't mean there's nothing to do until then. Rather, with the best sangha that one can find, to the best of one's understanding, to pursue association as per the way it's explained and taught in the Bhagavad and in the commentaries on the Bhagavad. This will be the best we can do, and as we mentioned in a previous class, we can also pray to Bhagavan to bless us with suitable association. There's or maybe that was in a different class, I don't remember, but there's a beautiful prayer of Yamunacharya in the Stotra Ratna, where he says, I forget it now. Kritanutama Bhukti Mukti sorry, it doesn't come to mind, but he says, he prays to Bhagavan, please give me the association of that bhakta of yours from whom even you feel separation, and in the eyes of whom all the objects of the world and even liberation are no more insignificant than grass, and whose sole aspiration is only the sight of you. So to pray for the association of a Mahatma is also most applicable in the life of a seeker. Does that answer your question?
Yes, Babaji is very clear, and I understand. Just like I was also thinking that it's coming by the grace and by the desire of the sadhaka to approach such a personality. But I have also another question. What makes the difference between what some are calling the cult of personality and the due respect to the Mahant, to the Mahatma? I don't know if I'm clear.
Okay, I'll have a go. Maybe it's what you're looking for or not, I'll see. One way we can define cult of personality is when people invest a degree of authority in a person that exceeds the authority fit for that person to have as per the guidelines of the Shastra. Or when people adore someone not as the Shastra teaches that sadhus and gurus are meant to be revered, but do in their own manner and style and liking. So, as we hear in the Prem Bhakti Chandrika, there is a statement, Shri Guru Bhakata Jan Tahare Charane Man Aropiya Kotha Anusare, where Thakur Mahashaya advises, let me fix my mind at the feet of the Guru and the Bhaktas in accord with the Katha. It's a bit of a cryptic statement. He just says, following the Katha, let me do that. So Chakravarti Pad, in his commentary on the Prem Bhakti Chandrika, he explains that there, Katha means Shastra Katha. In other words, how the Guru is to be followed, how the Guru is to be worshipped, the extent of the authority of the Guru, etc., etc., all of this is stipulated by, there's checks and balances on it given by the Shastra. So the Gurus, Sadhus, etc. are all to be revered, adored, and so forth, as per the guidelines given in the Shastra for that. So if someone never studies those guidelines, has no idea what they are, just, goes along in some popular movement and, adores some charismatic person, okay, whatever, they can do as they like. But if they want to call that, the bhakti taught by Mahaprabhu or the bhakti taught by our Goswamis, then we may not agree. Or, unless and until it checks out according to the system that's been established, it may be, loosely speaking, a variety of bhakti, or loosely speaking, some variety of, worship. But unless its characteristics are corroborated, it's something else. So there's no doubt injunction in the Shastra to show profound respect to the Guru, to the Sadhu, and so forth, but never in a way that's ultimately detrimental to the individual, to the recipient of the respect, or to society in general. Does that answer your question?
Yes, Babaji.
All right, well then, let's conclude there for today. So we've heard about bathing in the foot dust of Mahatmas, so, we pray to be blessed with such opportunity and to make the most of it in our lives. And in our next discussion, we'll continue with further understanding of the importance, the rarity, and the value of association with sadhus. So, Vaishnavebhyo Namo Nama, Jai Shri Guru, Jai Shri Gaur, Jai Jai Shri Shri Radhe Sham.
Shri Radhe.